Tim Marshall is a British journalist, author and broadcaster, and is a leading authority on foreign affairs with more than 30 years of reporting experience. He's also a guest commentator on world events for the BBC, Sky News, and is a guest presenter on LBC. He's recently published his book, Prisoners of Geography, Our World Explained in 12 Simple Maps, which is a fascinating introduction to world affairs and shows how the choices of world leaders are swayed by mountains, rivers and seas, and why geography means that history is always repeating itself.
In the reading corner this morning, I'm thrilled to welcome Tim Marshall, who's the author of a number of non-fiction books about geopolitics for adults, including the million-selling Prisoners of Geography. I'm really thrilled because this book has now been adapted for children, and as a passionate advocate of high-quality non-fiction for children, I'm especially pleased to welcome you today, Tim.
Thank you.
I suppose my first question really is how you came to be writing these kinds of books. I know that you were a correspondent for Sky News and that you have worked in conflict areas. So can you give us some specifics about how you came to think that this book needed to be written?
Early on in my career, when I started doing the conflict reporting, I quickly realised that there was always a geographic rationale behind some of the action that was going on, whether it was clearing out villages in a valley because you needed the valley, which led to a road, or a bigger concept. It always led back to geography. I mean, obviously there were other, there was economies and rationales and ideologies and all sorts of things, but and I realised that unless you factored in the geography, you weren't going to get a proper picture of it. And so I started factoring in that in my reporting, and I found it so useful, such a great prism or a frame within which to understand the context of what is happening, because I was always a great advocate of the why as well as the what is going on. So it's a kind of a natural progression. Once I quit full-time reporting and I wanted to write, and to my surprise, I wrote an international bestseller. And Hemingway said you should always write about what you know about. And that's one of the things I know something about, and so I carried on in that vein.
What do you attribute the fact that it captured the imagination of so many people to want to buy it? What do you attribute that to?
I think there's a number of things, including timing. That old cliche that timing is everything. Well, it isn't, but it is something. The book Prisoners of Geography came along at a few years after the order of things began to shake, by which I mean, it came out in, 2015? So just a few years after the financial crash, and the financial crash caused a lot of foundations to shake. There'd been a natural progression of change anyway. It always happens. The post-Second World War order is not going to last forever, and actually we are in the middle of it changing. At the same time, there was a huge increase in the movement of peoples, in technology, and all this stuff was swirling around, and people were struggling to make sense of it, and along came a book which does not purport to explain everything, but it does try to give a framework for understanding these changes, and a big part of that framework is geography. So if you want to understand why Russia, which is no longer this communist dictatorship, allegedly aggressive power, it's not the Soviet Union now, so why is it behaving the way it's behaving? Well, because whether it's Soviet or crony capitalist dictatorship, it doesn't matter. The geography of Russia is still the same, and the flat land in front of it is still flat. And if, whether you're Soviet or Putin, across that flat land, people have constantly aggressed you, you will seek to control that flat land. It doesn't really matter all that other stuff that's swirling around. And so I just think, when you put it in that context, a lot of people went, oh, right, yeah. And you can do that with every single country, and I try to do it with several of the countries to say, look, here is a way of understanding why countries are behaving the way they're behaving, along with all the other factors. I'm not a determinist.
Yeah, and that's something that we can pick up again, I think, in a little while. But as somebody who believes that the non-fiction that we write for children should not be patronising, that children are interested in the world they inhabit just as adults are interested in the world they inhabit. It's really good to see that this being adapted in a way that children can understand those big issues.
Absolutely.
So what did you have to do in order to make it accessible for the audience?
Number of things. I was struck by your thing about not being patronising. It's the same if you're writing for adults. A, don't be patronising, but B, also don't be arrogant. I mean, sometimes perhaps you can be that unknowingly, but I'll give you an example. I remember shouting at the telly one night when the BBC 9 o'clock news, a reporter used the phrase laissez-faire economics. And I said, why are you speaking French? And I do know what laissez-faire economics is, but a lot of people don't. And this is broad brush reporting. Why are you speaking French? There's a sort of arrogance there. So you don't want that either. You don't want to assume too much or too little. So it's a balance. So for children, I just had to... Basically, we brought 80,000 words down to... forgive me, I don't actually know, but let's say it's 10,000. So how do you do that without losing the essence? And that was the first challenge, and I think we have absolutely achieved that. We've absolutely got the essence. And I hope there's more, but the most important thing was getting the essence. And then over and over again, you have to go back to every single paragraph that is on the pages of the drawings and look at it and think, okay, would a 12-year-old understand that? Would an 8-year-old understand that? And at some point you have to say, well, you can't just write for the 8-year-old. You have to hit this balance. So that was a challenge, to look at the language and not to put it in too childlike terms, but also make sure you don't say laissez-faire economics. And then the last thing was the easiest thing, and that was to sign off on the drawings, because the drawings by Jessica and Grace are beautiful, and pretty much every single one that came through I said, yes, oh, that's lovely, that's lovely, that's lovely.
There's a couple of things that I wanted to say. First of all, that the illustrators are Grace Easton and Jessica Smith, and I agree they've done a stunning job. And I would argue, illustrated though it is, reduced though the number of words are, that this is a book for anybody. And as an adult reading it, I'm going to learn something new.
That's the feedback I've already had. I've been into a few schools already, and the geography teachers are saying, you know what, I'm going to read this. And parents have said, I'm going to read it with my children, which is lovely, a lovely idea. And I think you're right. And also the drawings again, they're illustrations, but there's something about them that is not childlike. This isn't fluffy bunny rabbits. Occasionally we've got a lovely choo-choo train chuffing across Siberia with smoke coming out, which is, that's a little childlike, because obviously trains aren't like that. But overall, no, the drawings are not childish. They're just attractive.
Definitely. I would also just like to say that I did a bit of a comparison and read your chapter on Russia in the adult book and the children's book next to each other.
You did your due diligence.
Just to see, and I actually did feel that I got the sense of it as much from the children's book. Obviously there's more detail.
Yes. Well, that example I gave you about the Russians, the North European plain being flat, obviously the entire chapter is caught up in the detail of that, and the detail of some of the ports freezing and the warm water ports issue, etc. And of course, for an adult, you want a whole chapter. For a younger audience, 7 or 8 paragraphs on that dotted around 4 or 5 pages. Yeah, that's what I meant about the essence. You can actually capture that essence.
It was good. It was great. So geopolitics isn't entirely a new thing. 1904 Mackinder.
Well, I would go back to the Greeks.
Oh right, okay.
No, really. I think it was Aristotle. One of the great names used to write about the importance of how big your city is and what is around it, and therefore what you can do. It's not classic geopolitics, but some people say that they were the fathers of it. But you mentioned Mackinder. This goes back to the early 1900s, where there were these new theories. As you mentioned, Mackinder, and Halford is another one. big, huge concepts of the Pacific Rim or the heartland, the heartland being the Euro-Asian landmass, and if you control it, you control the world, all that sort of stuff. I mean, I'm influenced by all that, and by the way, it went out of fashion big time.
Well, that was one of the things I was interested to know, the extent to which those ideas are still influential, or how they've actually been advanced or even contested.
Well, they were very, very influential for the first few decades of the 1900s. The problem is that after the Second World War, I think they were wrongly construed as being nationalistic and overly deterministic. I mean, in Prisons of the adult book, a couple of minor accusations, it's deterministic, even though I counted it once, 5 times in that book, that this is only one of the things that determines what happens, in conjunction with many others. I'm not saying geography is the determining factor But because of the Second World War, it fell out of fashion because it was thought to be nationalistic and deterministic, that we couldn't do anything about the cycles of history, which I don't agree with cycles of history. I think it goes in waves. And so it went out of fashion, and in fact some of the university professors to this day push back against it left, right and centre. However, there was a number of academic books that started to come out early 2000s, and to a lesser extent my non-academic book, which says, come on, it's obvious. How can geography not be a big factor in what happens? How can you ignore, for example, that Japan has no natural resources of oil or rubber, and when it wants to become this industrialised, advanced nation, it's going to go looking for rubber and oil, and it did, and that was one of the things that propelled it into war in the Second World War. I mean, how can you ignore that? So I think it's come back, and I think there is now a recognition that it's very useful to put this geographic stuff out there as part of the jigsaw.
Just want to stick with that theme for a moment and maybe just push it a little bit further, that notion of determinism. I think partially maybe the title, because it's Prisoners of Geography, and that implies captivity, maybe defencelessness. But I was going on to say that if you read your book, then equally implied within that is that without human motivation of either fear of the other or greed, that actually those limitations of geography wouldn't be as salient. I mean, I think that comes through if you read the book.
Oh yeah, you can break out of this prison. Technology completely can bend the bars to an extent, although sometimes when you're bending the bars, you're just changing the bits of geography that matter. For example, cruise missiles clearly bent the bars of geography, because before you would have to go from A to B with huge numbers of people and or ships. Now you can use cruise missiles if you prefer, but you're still going to have to factor in geography about where they take off from, how much you're going to hide them or guard them, what is their range, or you have to take into consideration the geography of the other country, that if they retaliate, what have they got and how far will it go? You still have to put geography into it.
So we can't escape. So that does
geography.
Come back to...
No, but you can A, bend the bars, and B, you could say liberated by geography, because but we're working on that let's say technology has bent some bars, we can now deliver, we have enough of everything in the world for everybody, and we actually have the means now to deliver it. So we have overcome some of those barriers, but we're now working, of course, on this is a very long-term project, on everybody agreeing that we need to distribute it perhaps better. So, but no, you are. A trite example is the Chinese emperor wakes up one morning and says, "I want to invade India," and of course the generals say, "What a great idea, sir!" But
you've got Tibet in the way.
You've got Tibet and the Himalayan plateau and everything else in the way. Yeah. You can't really escape geography, and so it influences your decisions. And the classic example, which is why I started with Russia. As well as the North European plain, is you haven't got a warm water port. If the only one you've leased off somebody, which is in Ukraine, Sebastopol, suddenly is endangered because Ukraine is now a friend of someone else, do you have a choice? yes, if you can overcome centuries of history and the entire sort of psyche of the Russian nation, perhaps you have a choice. But they invaded Ukraine, annexed Crimea, and made sure the port was theirs.
Yeah.
Because they were a prisoner of their geography and their history.
Yeah. I did want to just raise one further point about that, which I think connects, and that is that by and large, physical geography doesn't change. I mean, it will, but by and large, we have what we have. But the elements of it that are important change, don't they? So sea, presumably, is less important than it would have been?
No, I don't agree.
Okay.
I mean, you're right about the stage doesn't change in our time frame. I mean, obviously Scotland at one point was floating around somewhere near the equator, but we weren't around then. By the way, as an aside, not many people know this. Where England and Scotland came together tens of millions of years ago is almost exactly along the line of Hadrian's Wall.
Wow.
I mean, I'm sure that Gaia didn't know this and do this, or that Hadrian was channeling Gaia or whatever. But it's just a kind of interesting, if useless, fact. Where was I? The geography. No, absolutely. Sea or water transport remains something like 8 times cheaper than land transport. So it's absolutely still crucial. When you look at how much stuff is moved around the world, again, please don't quote me, but it is something like 80% by water. So you've got that costing, and it doesn't use as much fuel. But then also, because so much of it is moved, let's say it's 80%, it may not be, but it's a large majority of. Therefore, the choke points like the Malacca Straits, the Red Sea, Suez Canal, Gibraltar, the Bosphorus, they remain absolutely critical. Strait of Hormuz, where something, 50% of the energy in the world comes out of there. You control that. So I would argue that the sea is as important as it has been over several centuries.
Yeah. And even if the general person on the street doesn't know this, certainly our political leaders are very well aware of it. Can we just come to some of the detail?
Well, actually, you'd hope they would. You would hope they would know it.
If we come in to have a look at your wonderful book here, I'd like to start really by thinking about why it's organised in the way it is, why it starts with Russia.
It's the same as why it starts in the adult version, in the clearest example of the concept of prisoner is there in Russia because of the North European plain, because it's flat, but at its narrowest point is where Poland is now, and that the Russians have been invaded over and over and over again over the past few centuries through that gap. It's between the Baltic and the Carpathians. That's the clearest example that Russia really doesn't have a choice. Given the world the way it is at the moment, it will move forward and try and plug that gap and dominate that flatland. Right. It is a prisoner of its geography. And then you've got the frozen, the one port examples. So it's to set out and hopefully persuade somebody that yes, there's something in this concept. And so you then have got it framed as you move through the other chapters. As for how it's laid out, I'm going to have to look through it.
I think it goes from Russia to China, and I wondered whether it was size. Then we've got USA.
No, well, yeah, you have got the three great powers, geographic and size-wise, although not India.
Although Africa's.
Yeah, Russia, China, USA, and then Canada sort of followed on naturally from the USA, Europe. And I put Africa now. There's 54 countries in Africa, so we couldn't really do one for each country. Ditto Europe, but Europe and Africa follows Europe because we're making the point that, for example, Europe's coastline is very jagged, and that means that the rivers are deep, going in a long way, and it means that there are many deep water ports. Africa's coastline very smooth, great for beaches, not great for deep water ports, and it means that the rivers are quite shallow quickly. So we just wanted to juxtapose those two because Europe lends itself to economic growth and linking different communities as you grow organically over the centuries, and the other one doesn't. Africa, because of its smooth coastlines, because so many of its countries are landlocked, because of the great distances, and because of the rivers are not flat as many of our rivers are. Their rivers have got many more waterfalls, and of course if you've got a waterfall, you can't really move your goods downriver to sell them. So, that's why one follows the other.
Oh, right, okay. Interesting. It's unusual for those of us used to looking at atlases in school to have anything that doesn't start with actually it's usually the USA that's first, because even if it's published in Britain, nowadays it's usually USA that's first, yeah.
I never had any push. Prisons of Geography sold. Simon and Schuster took it on very nicely. There was no pushback. I mean, I rewrote the USA chapter to include some up-to-date stuff, but no, there was no pushback to put USA first at all.
I think that's because it was, I'm thinking about school atlases rather than anything else. I wondered whether we could, because it would be nice to dig into some of the detail, maybe have a look at a couple of sections. Sure. And maybe you'll allow me to choose the first, and then maybe you could choose the second. Because I'd love to.
Choose whatever you want.
I'd love to look at Africa, actually. And my reasons for choosing this is because I think it's an area, or it's a continent that is still not looked at a great deal in school. It goes under the radar a little bit. So that's why I've picked it. And as I was reading this section here, a number of things that really struck me. One is the colossal size and the fact that our globe often distorts things, so we're not really aware of the real size. And the other was to do with the way, obviously there's the whole thing about the rivers, and we've got this wonderful waterfall on the Zambezi, I think.
That's my favourite picture, the waterfall.
It really gets the power of that across. But then I was struck here by the kind of political boundaries as Africa has been able to throw off, if you like, some of the shackles. We're still on the prisoner theme, aren't we? Some of the shackles of colonialism. But what is actually left are political boundaries that are set by colonisers. And that has led to continued problems in Africa.
Yeah, this was one of a few sensitive issues. I mean, you can't not talk about colonialism. But, you don't want to go into too much horrific detail for children. But you also need to explain that it's still having an effect. I mean, so we draw attention to the, look, straight lines here and here. That's not normal, because countries normally grow up organically with rivers that meander and mountains that are different shapes, and that's why they are the shape they are. But here, it was not as organic. And, I mean, Nigeria is a decent example. It depends how you count them, but you could count 12 major ethnic groupings, many of which have different languages and different religions, and yet suddenly, very quickly, they're just thrown together into, you are a nation. Well, you are a state. You're not a nation state, you're a nation's state. And now get on with it. And of course, if traditionally you didn't interact as much, and you didn't trade as much, and you didn't consider yourself one people, to suddenly be told you are, now get on with it, is extraordinarily difficult. Now, many of these countries are making a decent fist of it. Others, not so much. I mean, again, if you talk about Nigeria, a civil war broke out in 1967 when the Igbo people wanted to become independent from the rest of the country. That's a good bit of information to hang on to, that there are still peoples inside these lines that might not want to be part of those lines. I don't think in this book it's the time or place to say, and several 100,000 of them were killed in the war that then followed. But you need to explain that there are these issues in there.
I think you do mention the fatalities in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which are just startling. 6 million.
Yeah, over 6 million people have died since the late 1990s. I mean, this is the balance thing. I'm just going back to, there was something on the previous page that caught my attention. Oh yeah, you talked about the size of it. Yeah, so we've got the big map of Africa, and then there's a box on the other page, and it shows exactly the outline of Africa, and then it says, and then it puts the countries that you could fit into it superimposed on it, which are the United States, China, Japan, India, Eastern Europe, Italy, Germany, France, Spain, Belgium, and the UK, all of those superimposed on this. And again, for a child, that gives you a concept of just how big this place is. So in Russia, we did. You can say 11 time zones, and we do. And you can say 17 million square kilometres, and we do. But then the train, which we've got, that says you need to be on this train for 6 nights and 7 days non-stop if you want to get from one side to the other. That's a much better idea of size.
Yes.
Sorry, going back to Africa.
Yeah, well, it seems to me, and I'm no expert and maybe not as informed as I should be, but it seems to me that there's a paradox here in terms of what we're talking about with small tribes and nations, and then an overall Pan-African movement, which is...
Well, there is such a thing as a Pan-African consciousness. It's actually only because of colonialism, I would argue, because every single country was colonised except for Ethiopia, which, as an aside, the reason that many of the flags of Africa are red, gold and green, or have red, gold and green in them, is because of the Ethiopian flag. There is nothing inherently African about red, gold and green. It's just that so many of the countries, when they won independence, took inspiration from the Ethiopians. When they designed their flags, they put the colours in. I mean, not all of them, but many of the flags, you'll see those colours. And that also speaks to the Pan-African concept that, from top to bottom and from east to west, there was a shared experience which to this day still has an effect. So Pan-Africanism is real as a concept. In practice, the states behave like every other state. Some are aggressive to others, some have an affinity and alliance with others, some dominate others. I mean, they're no, why would they be any different? South Africa dominates economically. There are as many ethnic tensions in Africa as there are anywhere else in the world. I mean, for example, this year, I'm afraid, when the rioting broke out in South Africa, in previous years it's been Zimbabweans that were targeted. This year it was Nigerians. There's 700,000 Nigerians working there, and they were told to pack their bags and go home. And there was a lot of not necessarily race riots or ethnic rioting against them. Nigerians actually had to charter planes to get them out of there. I'm not starry-eyed about Pan-Africanism, but I understand the concept of it is from a shared experience.
And would you say that the European Union is a parallel for that in some way?
The Europeans, because of their shared experience of war, came together after the Second World War, and through economic cooperation have managed to bury a lot of those hatchets. It would have been unbelievable 100 years ago. And how far they've come, and it is through trade. Now it's fraying, like all economic orders and social orders have a sell-by date, and ours is changing. And you go 70 years after the Second World War, well, the horrors of it begin to fade. There is a statute of limitations on historical memory and how deep it goes. You'll make a joke about the Mongols sacking Baghdad. I mean, they killed every single person in the city, 30,000. You can make jokes about that. You can't make jokes about the Holocaust. It's too close and too raw. So I worry that the post-Second World War order, including the concept of the EU, is fraying. I think the EU will survive. Sorry, I've come a bit off topic, but
and so have I. But it's interesting.
The EU comes from a shared experience. Yes, and trying to do something about that shared experience and make it better. I mean, there's something called the African Union as well. And they were very clever when it was first formed in the 50s. They said, we're not going to try and redraw these boundaries, because they knew if they tried to redraw them, every single one of these countries would go to war with other countries over their boundaries. I mean, there have been difficulties. South Sudan was born out of massive bloodshed and then immediately fell into civil war. But apart from that, most of those boundaries have held, and despite the many problems, and indeed the bloodshed, Biafra, for example, it is probably for the best that the boundaries mostly do hold. Although again, the passage of time, there are peoples inside each of the countries who are thinking, I don't want to be part of this country. I want to be independent. I mean, there's something... Zanzibar has an independence movement. Parts of Kenya, there's a Mombasa is not Kenya movement, etc., etc. And it'll be interesting to see how the states deal with this concept of independence and nationalism, because of course they all had the concept of independence and self-control for them against the colonialists, but now, decades on, there are movements inside the countries which are talking about self-determination.
So hard, isn't it, to get a grasp on anything until you can think about it from the inside. Really hard. Tell me where you would like to take us in this book.
Canada. A little pull-out from the main map. And you can see here where people in Canada live. They all live pretty much next to the American border, because this is the ice cap.
Yes.
But you can't get through the ice and the rock. Half of the whole population of Canada lives around Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton and Ottawa. And all of them are right then hard against the US border. So there's this vast, vast country, and yet people live in a tiny bit of it.
Yes.
A bit like Egypt, actually. Vast country, almost everyone lives right next to the Nile.
Yeah. So is there a huge difference here between East and West in
Canada? Yeah, with the French and the English speaking. I mean, they have forged a nation. I mean, Canadians are Canadian. Most of them are, from knowledge, are Canadians first, and then French speaking or English speaking second. And it's important to keep that concept of togetherness going, unless you want to split. And obviously, there was the French speaking independence movement. It waxes and wanes, but yeah, I mean, again, you look at it and you see how far apart.
Because haven't you got the Rockies between one side and the other?
Exactly. And this is another side of colonialism in a way. I've not really thought about it very much, but I mean, America does not make that much sense geographically. If it had grown up organically over centuries and centuries, it wouldn't be one state. There would be whatever California would be called something else, and it would be that side of the Rockies might be, because it wouldn't be natural for it to be one state from ocean to ocean. It was because it was an expansionist invasion, basically, that raced across the 3,000 miles in a very short period of time, and thereby forged a nation. It didn't grow up organically. America is in some respects an idea. I mean, the geography of the place. I mean, the desert peoples and the peoples up there in the eastern seaboard would have grown up completely differently, different languages, but they expanded so rapidly. Yeah. But it's the best piece of real estate in the world, and so if you control the whole lot, ocean to ocean, you're made economically.
Fascinating. So geopolitics, as I understand it, is not only about describing why things are the way they are, but it's also about using it to help make future predictions and trajectories. What kinds of things will influence the way that it might change in the future? Technology maybe is one aspect.
Technology definitely is one aspect about what we will do and how we will do it. But climate change, for example, I mean, the Bangladeshi government is doing the modelling and working out what to do if the modelling comes true, and that the bottom third of its country is even more salinated by the sea flooding that comes up the rivers. And because if it's going to happen, and it looks likely, then in 50, 60 years, tens of millions of people will not be able to live in that part of the world, and so they better do some planning about that. So climate change is already having a serious impact on the movement of peoples. Technology also is allowing people to move more. So I mean, this isn't pure geography, but it is geopolitics, which takes into account demographics and all the rest of it. Again, if you look at Africa, it's a good example, as a continent, and the movement of peoples, it is overwhelmingly from the south towards the north, the richer north, Europe and elsewhere, but certainly north. Now, the current rate of movement, why would it decline? And if climate change, which is one of the drivers of movement, poverty and conflict are probably greater, but of course climate change also helps conflict. There's about 1 billion Africans at the moment, and by 2060, some modelling has it as 2 billion. Rapid expansion of peoples. So if you believe that the continent can create an extra 1 billion jobs in a few decades, and all the roads and the hospitals and the doctors that you need to train and the teachers, and you can create viable living standards, then that rate of movement will not increase. If they cannot create enough jobs for the extra billion people, some of those people will move, in which case the rate of movement of peoples is going to increase. So I think you can predict that mass movement of peoples has not peaked, and from that you need to draw some conclusions about your policy on border control, your policy on immigration, your policy on how many schools you're going to build in your country, because it's no good just looking at your population growth as it is. You have to factor in this, and that is to do with climate change, poverty, war, and the geographic factors you then immediately look at, and you look at the routes of travel, and it all just swirls around. And if you don't understand the geography and you don't look at a map, you're missing a trick.
Yeah, it's important stuff, isn't it?
Yeah.
Bringing it back to young readers, I don't know whether this is something that you will have considered, but how would you hope they might use that knowledge that they acquire from reading a book like this?
I confess not having given it that much thought, because it's just kind of like, oh, this is knowledge, it's a good thing. What colour is its own reward. I was at Cheltenham Book Festival a couple of years ago, and a young woman came up to me and said, could you sign me a book? Oh, thank you very much. And then she said, I hated geography at school. And I said, yeah, me too. She said, I didn't particularly like politics or history, but I read your book, and now I'm studying international relations at Bristol University. Oh, now that was such a boost and an accolade. I was very honoured. And so and it happened a few times, to be honest with you, and I took that and I thought, well, if I have in some small way inspired a few minds, perhaps we can do it to a younger readership. I mean, it's funny, when I was 12, I was simultaneously a bit of a rascal and simultaneously a bit of a nerd. I mean, it's not often you mix these. I mean, a few years later, I was invited to leave school at age 16. It was an equitable arrangement. They said, Mrs. Marshall, Tim, we think it would be better if you didn't come back next term. And everyone agreed, so it was fine. So the point being that I was simultaneously not that well behaved, but a nerd, because I would have eaten this book up.
Yeah.
Because I was fascinated by the world. And so taking the example of the young lady and taking the example of the 12-year-old me, I just hope that A, you learn something, but B, it's a jumping off point. Because, in talks I give, there's a still I show of Australia at night, just the urban electric footprint. And I say, right, from that one image, you can start to think about other things. I say, so why do you think they're all there? Why do you think there's no lights on at night in this big bit in the middle? And from that, you can just jump off into so many other things. And I just think there's an awful lot of jumping off points in this for when you're capable of actually doing more conceptual stuff later.
Yeah. Well, it has been a real pleasure talking to you. I've learnt a lot this morning. I've learnt a lot from reading your book, both for children and for adults. And I agree that, knowledge is the start of action, really, if action can be taken. And you certainly don't do it by withholding knowledge from children. So thank you so much for sharing with us today, Tim.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to In the Reading Corner with Just Imagine. If you have enjoyed this podcast, you can find many more on the podcast section of our website, justimagine.co.uk, plus via iTunes or SoundCloud or your usual podcast provider. Don't forget to pass the pod and recommend this fantastic free resource to your friends and colleagues.